Okay, so I want to go over the overview. I want to continue to go back to the overview just so that we continue to see what the scope of what we're doing is. We are, as you will see, a little behind. I'm not surprised that we're a little behind, and I specifically left the fifth class to be time for us to talk about what we can do, but also extra time for some of the things that I've got listed for week 4 that we probably won't get to today. All right, so we have looked at what Christian nationalism, why it's dangerous, what it is, why it's dangerous, and then we've been kind of walking through history with what I am calling an illustrated history, right? We're not just doing dates and numbers, but we're talking about, why the things that happened, because we don't just study history to know what happened, right? We study history to understand what's happening now. So if we don't go back and ask the question, how did we get here? How did modern evangelicalism shift from being fairly apolitical to being a tremendous actor on the scene of American politics right now, and to having a tremendous amount of power in American politics? We have to go back to figure that out. All right, more history, week 3. This is week 4. So we'll talk about contemporary Christian nationalism. We're going to start in 1980. We finished with what I've told you I think is the pivot point, with the formation of the moral majority, the strong move of Christian evangelicals into the Reagan era and into support of Reagan, when Carter actually would have made more sense, at least in terms of what his religious commitments were. So we'll start there. That really is the beginning of the Christian nationalism that we know today. And we will get today up to the present. We're not going to talk a ton about things that have happened in the last couple of years, because you've been around for that. We can discuss it. I don't have a whole ton of slides on it. And next week we'll finish up. I don't think we'll probably get to things like the New Apostolic Reformation this week, but we might. And if not, we'll start next week, talk about that, talk about the Seven Mountains Mandate, or Seven Mountain Mandate. It's given both ways. Spiritual warfare, if you've heard that phrase. And I'll tell you my bookstore story. And conspiracy theories and authoritarianism are threads that run underneath all of this, as we've seen already, right? Okay, and I want to go all the way back, because we are at week 4, and pick up several definitions that we pulled out of some of the books on the bibliography. So here's one from Whitehead and Perry, their excellent book called Taking America Back for God. They define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework, a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. And we have, as we've gone through the history, you've seen that, right? That the sort of increasing influence of, in particular, certain strains of American Christianity. Christian nationalism, this is Kaylor Underwood, Baptizing Jesus, which is the book about mainline Protestantism and Christian nationalism. Their definition is, or their description is, Christian nationalism seeks to conflate national and religious identities in a way that inherently provides Christians with a privileged place in American society. And one more, Gorski and Perry, the flag and the cross. Gorski and Perry have studied this movement. They come at it from social science. So their book, if you're a little wonky, I'd recommend their book for you. White Christian nationalism's deep story goes something like this. America was founded as a Christian nation by, parenthetically, white men who were traditional Christians who based the nation's founding documents on Christian principles. The United States is blessed by God, which is why it's been so successful. And the nation has a special role to play in God's plan for humanity. But these blessings are threatened by cultural degradation from un-American influences, both inside and outside our borders. Okay, so as we go on from 1980 to the present, I wanted us to have these definitions freshly in our minds. And one more thing, and what we have seen as we've moved forward from the 1950s is the increasing influence of evangelicalism and the kind of streamlining of what it means to be an American evangelical, right? Because evangelicalism and fundamentalism goes all the way back to the Azusa Street revival and before that. You know, evangelical, as we've discussed, evangelical is a troubling word because it's difficult to define. It's in the name of our church. But when we're talking about white evangelical faith, we are more so talking about more of Pentecostal, more of a fundamentalist kind of faith. So, a different book by Whitehead, American Idolatry. At the beginning, he lays out these are the cornerstones of white evangelical faith. Andrew Whitehead comes out of American evangelicalism, so he speaks from kind of within the movement, which is why he starts out by saying, "This is how I grew up." So these are the 5 cornerstones. Families are the cornerstone of a society, and when the family breaks down, society breaks down. Families are made up of a dad, a mom, and kids. Children obey parents, and fathers are the head of the household. 2, Christianity always works for the good throughout society. The United States is great, and that is due to its Christian heritage. Christians should categorically oppose abortion, homosexuality, and divorce because the Bible clearly teaches that each is wrong. Allowing these things to exist in our society will erode the greatness of our nation, ensuring its collapse. 4, war might be terrible, but the United States has always fought for good, helping achieve God's will for the world. Therefore, war is sometimes necessary, even godly. We're going to talk a bit about war because the pivot point in the current incarnation of Christian nationalism in the United States is 9/11. And I don't even think that's arguable. Therefore, war is necessary and perhaps even godly. Secular society will destroy your faith, so you must be careful what you read, listen to, or interact with outside church. If we had time to do a whole day on the media and Christian nationalism, we would talk a lot about this, about the isolationism inherent in a movement that says you only use our sources. I think I've got another slide. So here, this is my reframe of Whitehead. Listen to us, and we will tell you what is right and good. No need to check what we say against any outside sources. We are the only ones who can be trusted. Have you heard this from folks? All right. So that is the question. Tell me about feelings. How do you feel when you hear these descriptions of faith in Christian nationalism? What feels the most out of step for you? And I recognize the assumption in my question that for those of us in this room, what we just heard is going to feel out of step with how we understand ourselves as citizens and people of faith. So tell me how you're feeling about all this right now.
I grew up with those messages. I grew up in Mississippi, and fortunately, I couldn't wait to leave. I mean, I had a good family and I had a good upbringing, but my parents were very, very strict about the Christian nation and how we acted and things.
I feel angry and upset by it. I'm wondering, it just seems as though it's becoming more and more pervasive in political life, and it's trying to fuse the church and the state, and that's just not right for us. It's not good. It's not constitutional. It's not scriptural. So I'm really wondering how best to cope with that.
I feel angry as described so far by folks, but also deeply saddened because my view of God is entirely different than this. And so it makes me sad that folks have such a limited view of God.
I guess I share that same sort of sadness, but we do have a totally different concept or view of God in relationship to human beings. Whereas I think in Lutheran theology is strong on God's acceptance of the sinner, and the evangelical point seems to be change your way and make yourself acceptable to God. And that seems to be what they're trying, what is the attempt in the country now, is to change our way so that we go back to God, whatever that is. And it seems to be catching on. That Newsweek article about Trump's popularity, or how the nation is feeling that there are now more people feeling that the country is on the right direction, on the right course. And that disturbs me. To me, it's just the opposite. I feel we're on the wrong course. And yet it is a growing acceptance of what's going on.
There's this constant feeling of being chosen. And the problem with being chosen is that indicates that there are some that aren't chosen. And so if we're chosen, then we're the ones on top, and that puts everybody else beneath us.
We're going to talk about that today, Joyce. Amy, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I guess I have a real sense of irony when I read the sentence, Christianity always works for the good throughout society, thinking about things that have happened throughout history, not just in the United States, but throughout history, where it was convert or die mentality at one point in time, and just the things that are happening now.
Yeah, it's a little revisionist, isn't it?
Yes.
just a touch.
I find myself wondering, like, where does this all end? And also, I'm like that little Dutch boy trying to stop the flood with my finger in the dike, because it doesn't end well for any of us, because when we say we're chosen, we're not going to be the chosen ones. We're going to be the heretics. We're going to be the apostates. We're going to be the people who are not Christian, because we're not doing it the right way. And, I feel like I'm trying to save a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of terrible stuff. And I don't know how to do that. So.
Well, I can tell you that the struggle that you all are facing is extremely real. By the way, my name is Jerry Koch. I work with Metropolitan Congregations United. I'm a fully deconstructed fundamentalist. Just left MAGA a couple of years ago. I still work in a digital environment that is MAGA-centric. I get lots of pushback. They don't like the facts. But as an advocate against domestic and sexual violence and human trafficking, and with all the corruption that we see within the church on that side of things, Robert Morris, Mike Bickle, the list goes on. The struggle is very real. And it's difficult to break the spell that they're under. But I've been presenting them the history that has been untangled by John Collins and Charles Paisley. They have a YouTube channel called Leaving the Message. If y'all want to do a deep dive into this, go check that out. Because what blew my mind was when I ran across the fact that Jim Jones was originally raised up by the Assembly of God Church, my childhood denomination. And Jonestown happened when I was 14 years old. I remember seeing that on TV. It blew my mind. It blew my mind. So yeah, we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but there is progress being made. And there are a lot of ex-MAGA that are speaking out. And I keep sharing those testimonies along with, there's nothing wrong with changing your mind with the evidence or with new evidence presented. That's all we can do, you know, but I think I heard somebody invoke Dr. Hassan's bite model. You know, behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotion control. That's all it takes to build a cult. That's all it takes. This is a complicated mess. And yeah, like y'all, I'm fighting to try to get things untangled. I'm fighting to try to wake people up. But I appreciate what you're doing in trying to untangle the history and the language. The coded language is especially important to understand if you really want to communicate with these people.
Yep. Indeed. Thank you. Thank you. It is a lot. It is interesting. I will say for me, watching the cultic behavior unfold before our eyes, because it doesn't usually unfold on a national scale. And I won't say it did in Germany, because then somebody will get mad, because they'll give me and not everybody's a Nazi thing, but this is probably, certainly in my lifetime, I've not watched that behavior unfold in front of us. Any other hands up or anything in the chat before we move on?
Like you're good to move on.
All right. 1980, what happened in 1980? With heavy backing from the moral majority. Remember, the last thing that we talked about last week was 1979 and the formation by Jerry Falwell of the moral majority, with a specific mandate to influence policy and politics. So November 4th, 1980, heavily backed by the moral majority, Ronald Reagan wins the presidency. Not as much evangelical support as Trump would get in both of his winning elections. But he won handily over Carter, and that's a whole thing. The Reagan presidency, you probably remember if you have been around for a bit, marked by disinvestment in social programs, anti-communist sentiment, right? Probably the most famous thing he ever said was, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And what came to be called Reaganomics, massive deregulation of industry, large tax cuts, and cuts in non-military spending. Military spending went up under Reagan, but social program spending went down, particularly in areas like mental health and food assistance, things like that, that we're, again, we're sort of seeing that come back again, right? This is significant. In summer of 1986, just linguistically, Gallup begins to ask in its polls, would you describe yourself as born again or evangelical? And their reasoning for asking this question is because they believe the views of a large block of evangelical voters likely will be a major factor in the 1988 presidential election. So this is the moment when you start seeing the national pollsters realizing that this group, and again, born again, evangelical, the language is slippery. Some people describe themselves as one or the other. Some people describe themselves as both. That this group is now seen as influential in our presidential politics. All right. Then I don't have a lot about the 90s. The 90s were, at least according to some of our authors, frustrating time for the Christian right. This is Onishi Preparing for War. I really like this book. I think this is the most accessible of all of the books. In the late 1990s, however, many white evangelicals felt as if the country was slipping further and further away from its exceptional role as God's chosen land. Despite James Dobson's focus on the family, James Dobson's movement for family values, there were signs of godlessness all around. President Clinton was embroiled in an adultery scandal involving an intern. This was the era of fierce debate over same-sex civil unions and eventually the legalization of same-sex marriage. The American family was changing. Mixed-race couples were increasingly normalized in many parts of the country. So the 90s were sort of a pendulum swing more toward the progressive, and a time of some frustration then for the folks who had made a lot of progress in influencing politics in the late 70s and through the 80s. Kristen Kobes-Dumais' book, Jesus and John Wayne, is also just a wonderful source for what the social undercurrent of this movement has looked like for almost 100 years. And so this is her thinking about the late 80s into the 90s and talking about, so what happens at the end of the Reagan presidency is the Soviet Union begins to collapse, the wall comes down in Berlin, and folks who had been fighting against communism and who had held up communism as this enormous foe and used it then to galvanize a movement, were sort of scrambling, trying to figure out, okay, so what is it now? If we can't call everything communist, what are we going to do? And so this is Kristen Kobes-Dumais. I like this quote. For decades, anti-communism had been a linchpin in the evangelical worldview, justifying militarism abroad and a militant pursuit of moral purity at home. The victory of the free world was something to celebrate, but it was also disorienting. Without a common enemy, it would be more difficult to sustain militant expressions of the faith. Hang on to this because this is significant. We're talking into the mid-90s, and then watch what happens in another half a decade, right? We have people sort of trying to find a common enemy, trying to figure out, they have built a faith on militarism, at least semantic militarism, and oftentimes actual militarism, which was easy in the Cold War because you weren't fighting an actual war, right? It was very much a war of ideas. I mean, there were skirmishes, but So why is a militant expression of the faith necessary for this? And I'm now saying evangelical / Christian nationalist because at this point they're beginning to fuse. What we can define in America as an evangelical viewpoint is also evangelical, capital E. That should be a capital E. Sorry about that. And what we can define as Christian nationalism in many ways have so much overlap that they're almost fused now. So why is this necessary? Why is this militant expression of faith so important?
So I was finding myself thinking about the movie Wicked. And at the end, towards the end, Elphaba is with the wizard and she realizes he's the one who's been behind the whole animals are evil, we need to get rid of all the talking animals movement. And she's like, why are you doing this? And he said, basically, in effect, the best way to bring people together is to have a common enemy. And, it's kind of the same thing we talked about. I think it was last week, we talked about needing to find a kind of a common banner to bring the moral majority together. And they knew that it wasn't going to be segregation, although that's really what it was, but they could get everybody behind going after abortion. So it was that common, this is what's ruining our society. We need to get rid of abortion and we need to. And so I remember hearing that when we watched the movie Wicked and just feeling sick to my stomach, like, oh my God. So I think that's why it needs to be militant, is because that you get that common enemy. And that is what, I think in a way the wizard is right. I mean, he's not morally or ethically or spiritually right, but phenomenologically he's right. You know, it's like you get that common enemy and everybody's gonna get behind it.
It's a great analogy, Megan. Thank you.
This comes from Ashley in the chat. And it's because it's dramatic and it's classically patriarchal. They don't want to look like snowflakes. It's what bullies do.
Yep. And if you haven't seen Wicked, some of these parallels are really striking.
Well, that would explain then why that side of things is reacting so negatively to that movie.
Yeah. Just one more really quick thing. I remember when I think Bush was in office, the second Bush, he was in office when the third part of one of the Star Wars movies came out, and people in that administration were so angry, saying that it was against Bush, the whole thing of authoritarianism rising up and militaristic language and fighting the other, and I don't know, just all those kinds of things. And it's like, well, if the shoe fits, wear it. I'm quite certain that they didn't create this, come up with the concept for this movie after you came into office. So
Well, what I find ironic about that, have you all heard about that God's Not Dead Part 5? Oh, it's bad. It's bad. It's full on Christian nationalist. It's in DC. It's horrible. I haven't watched it, but I've seen enough reviews. It's bad.
It is interesting that people who are adept at manipulating symbolism are also tend to see it everywhere. Tend to think that everything is then directed back at them because they know how easy it is to do that. All right, anybody else in the chat or?
I think all they can do is project. It's gotten to a point now where any accusations they make are turning out to actually be confessions. Anyway, I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Fair enough.
Only other comment is just that it incites or ignites emotion rather than thinking.
Yep. Very emotional movement.
I also
Very.
think, I also think military language evokes power, fear, and control. And so, it can certainly be effective in the right way.
Yep.
As a veteran, I'll say fact check true.
Here's the continuation of the quote from Jesus in John Wayne, which pulls us from this sense of not having a center when communism doesn't fall, but when the Soviet Union in particular comes apart and people feel decentralized in the Christian nationalist and evangelical movements. This is Kobe's Dumay's idea of what happened next, and we're going to see it unfold as we look at the rest of the history. Yet, even as the Cold War came to an anticlimactic end, the crusade theory of warfare endured. A flexible guide to combat, it could be employed to justify aggression against threats both foreign and domestic. Among Christian nationalists, it could effectively sanctify any engagement where the United States resorted to force. On the home front, it could validate questionable or even ruthless tactics wielded in defense of Christian America. Fortunately, we haven't seen any of that lately. In heroic pursuits of a higher good, the ends would justify the means. Conservative evangelicals knew they were called to fight the Lord's battle. It just wasn't entirely clear what that battle would be. And the battle got clearer. So, the 2000s. November of 2000, George W. Bush is elected. Again, strong support from evangelicals. What's interesting about that is that he actually is one of them. His father is like an Episcopalian, but George W. is a classical evangelical. The two of them are kind of interesting. He's a Texas evangelical. September 11th, 2001, we all know what happened. Religious radicals attacked the U.S. using commercial aircraft. Bush understands it as a crucible moment, which it is. The country unites around fear, and perhaps for a lot of people around a thirst for vengeance, which begins to explain what happens next. October 7th, less than a month later, the U.S. invades Afghanistan in Operation Enduring Freedom, ostensibly to find and bring to justice or kill Osama bin Laden, head of al-Qaeda and orchestrator of the September 11th attacks. Anybody know off the top of your head, this is in a later slide, but anybody know off the top of your head what year Osama bin Laden was actually killed? Who was president?
Obama.
Yeah. I don't expect you to remember the year, but it was 2011. So 10 years into the war, they Navy SEALs find and take out bin Laden. Anybody know what year the war ended? Who was president?
Would be the first year of Biden's administration, wasn't it?
It was 10 years later.
While we have a pause, can you restart your screen share? It seems to have locked.
Oh, sorry.
I don't think it was you. I think there's a glitch somewhere that happened.
Thank you, Tim. I would never have known. It looked fine on my screen. All right, let's see if it's gonna, nope. Sorry, guys. Zoom has gone to a new share screen. There it is. Aha. Okay, can everybody see the 2000s at the top of your screen?
We can.
Okay. Excellent. Well, we're off that slide. Good, we're done with that one. And I'm going to move this bar so hopefully it won't kill things. Immediately following the September 11th attacks, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld launches a massive intelligence and military effort to look for information to tie Saddam Hussein to the 9/11 attacks. I think most of us probably remember all of this. I also think it's an incredibly important pivot point from the everything was out loud Reagan years into these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the way that we came, particularly the way that we came into the Iraq war and what it meant for our relationship across the world. So Rumsfeld decides this is a good reason for us to go into Iraq. And they can't find a tie between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attacks. The 9/11, almost all of them, you might remember, were Saudis. The reason that we went into Afghanistan was because of Osama bin Laden. And we like Saudi Arabia, so we didn't attack them. So they can't find anything to tie Saddam Hussein to the 9/11 attacks. So they begin this effort to find weapons of mass destruction. And in 2003, on February 5th, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, goes to the United Nations and testifies that the U.S. has strong evidence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. And the next month, March of 2003, we invade Iraq. Sorry. And the next month, I can forward my slides. Okay, I've got a couple of these slides. I think it's important to look at the scope of what we lost. How many people did we lose on 9/11? Americans killed, ballpark.
3,300? 3,300?
Just under 3,000 is the official, but yeah, that's perfect. And then we started a couple of wars. The wars, we don't have to look at all of this, but the number of Americans who were killed in Iraq was 4,500. The number of people wounded, though, is the number we need to look at, right? 32,000 Americans, many grievously wounded. The death tolls in wars are coming down because we can keep people alive, but people are coming home with terrible wounds. And that does not count the coalition forces lost, the impact on Iraqis. Okay, April of 2005, the CIA's top weapons inspector reports, after a long period of study, that there are no WMDs in Iraq. That war continues for 6 more years, 6.5 more years, until 2011. All right, the Afghan War, we're going back in time for a moment. The Afghan War starts 2001. Remember, it started in the fall of 2001 after 9/11. Osama bin Laden is killed May 2nd, 2011. The war continues until 2021. All right, here's one from the greatest hits of American evangelicalism in the last 50 years. Remember this quote? This is Jerry Falwell as a guest on the 700 Club 2 days after 9/11. And he said this: throwing God out successfully with the help of the federal court system, throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools. It's a little non sequitur, sorry. The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this because God will not be mocked. And when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. So you can see the evolution of Jerry Falwell from I don't want to talk about abortion in the mid-70s to this is 2001. The pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actually trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who have tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen. All right, raise your hand if you remember when that quote came out. Am I the only one? I can't see everybody. Thank you, Tom.
There's 3-4 hands at least going up.
So a couple of things are. Jane Berta, go ahead. Are you just raising your hand because you remember?
Oh no, I was raising my hand because I remembered that. Sorry.
Thank you. So a couple things happening here. First of all, look how quick and opportunistic this quote is. And then can you feel the attempt to coalesce around an enemy now that we've lost communism? Communism is gone. People are flailing a little bit. Who can we be upset with? Well, let's go back to our tried and trues and invade a couple countries while we're at it. So my question for all of us before we start talking about the nuts and bolts and the Trump years is in 10 seconds, who are we? Anybody have an answer or response?
One comment in the chat, it's a very gray area.
It's a gray area. Yeah, it's kind of a weird slide, isn't it? It's a black and white slide, but you're absolutely right. It's a gray area question. It feels to me like as a people we're beginning to struggle with the sense of national identity is strikingly.
My brother and I are very much opposites politically. He is not a Trump supporter, but we see things very differently. And we had a conversation recently where both of us were like, we don't even know, we don't even recognize this country anymore. And my brother said he feels like he doesn't have a party anymore, and he's been involved in Republican Party politics for decades. So I think there's a lot of trying to figure out who we are. And just as I'm saying this, it's like it's sometimes it's easier when you're feeling that way to define who you're not.
Mm.
And so it's like, well, yeah, so that kind of ramps up that, oh, well, we're not them and we're not them and we're not them. So, we defend ourselves against them. So,
And isn't what Falwell's doing, right? Here are all the things that we're not. And these are all the people who are to blame for 9/11. All right, I'm going to keep going. The 2010s. November 8th, 2016, Donald Trump is elected president, receiving a record 81% of what is identified as the white, born-again / evangelical Christian vote. There is a group that identifies itself as Black evangelical. They came out for Trump more strongly in the last election than they did in 2016. He made a concerted effort to reach out to certain groups, certain people of color. But that's how this group is identified in exit polls: white, born again / evangelical Christian voters. October 28th, I think this is interesting just because of what we were talking about earlier and the use of media and information as a weapon in this movement. October 28th, 2017 is the date when the 4chan user who calls himself Q Clearance Patriot posts the first tease of a scandal involving Hillary Clinton. And the whole Q movement starts, and the use of media starts to really kind of go off the rails. And this is a quote from Onishi in Preparing for War. Within months, followers of Q believed that then President Donald Trump was fighting a cabal of the global 1% who supposedly worshiped Satan, ran a global pedophile ring out of a pizza parlor, and were working to topple the Trump administration before it could expose them. So this is the weaponizing of information and particular forms of media, particularly social media. So through the 2010s, we begin to, I just think this is interesting. I don't know how germane it is, but it's interesting to me. Throughout the 2010s, we witness kind of one after the other the downfall of some of the evangelical hero figures that have been lifted up by this very muscular, combative form of Christianity. People like Mark Driscoll, you may have heard of. He's the guy from Mars Hill in Washington. And he had a spectacular fall from grace. C.J. Mahaney, Darren Patrick, there's a whole list of folks. Jerry, you named one earlier.
Robert Morris.
Yep.
Mike Hayes recently was arrested. There's all that scandal around Mike Bickle. What about what's going on over there at Daystar around Joni Lamb and that little curse that she cast out a week or so back against any of the accusers? Or who was it? Dr. Michael, I think it was Dr. Michael Brown was talking about the accusers of the brethren. I mean, those folks are terrified because they are tangled and embroiled in so many scandals. But yeah, you're right. You're right.
There's a great deal by this time, there's a great deal of tolerance for, I think what we would all agree is some pretty anti-Christian behavior and rhetoric, right? I doubt I'm alone in this room in being someone who has said, how are folks feeling like what they're doing is Christian, right? When it bears no relationship to the teachings of Jesus and the way of Jesus. But there's just been this increasing tolerance to the point where you get people who are so outside. Mark Driscoll. Read something about Mark Driscoll if you don't know who he is. There's a nice podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill that will make you mad, but you won't be able to stop listening to it because it's almost like a soap opera. But he horribly sexist, really abusive to staff and members of his church, and people let it go on for years. But eventually, even Paula White, President Trump's spiritual advisor, is starting to fall off the grace wagon because eventually folks tend to get exposed. All right, 2018, something called Project Blitz launches as a coalition of over 40. Have you heard of this? I have to tell you, I'd never heard of this. We're coming into a lot of information that is wielding, or a lot of groups and coalitions and people who are wielding tremendous influence, and a lot of us don't know who they are and have not heard of them. I had not heard of Project Blitz. Maybe I should have. But it launches. It's a coalition of over 40 groups, and they're providing model legislation to do these things: to protect the free exercise of traditional Judeo-Christian religious values and beliefs in the public square, okay, defined by this group. Encourage the teaching of the Bible in public schools, protect healthcare workers, adoption, foster care agencies, protecting their right to discriminate and still receive federal funds. Remember, that's how this all gets started, with segregation academies who are being told if you don't admit Black students, you won't receive federal funds. It isn't that people are arguing about their ability to do what they want to do. They want to have cake and they want to eat cake. They want to get federal dollars for doing things that the federal government has said is wrong. Putting In God We Trust on license plates and in public schools. So how effective are these people being so far? Have you seen In God We Trust on a license plate?
No.
No? Cool.
The police cars in my little town have it on their cars.
Wow.
It
feels like a First Amendment thing.
It's in quotation marks though, which makes me laugh because is that ironic then? I don't understand what that means. But anyway.
Does anyone know if all of the current cuts to so many agencies, et cetera, are not cutting and still allowing to receive federal funds, in your bullet point number 4, certain, adoption, foster care, et cetera, Christian nationalist backed agencies, I guess I'll call them. Does anyone know if those are on the chopping block too, or being spared?
Good question. There are a lot of unintended consequences of these executive orders, and people who thought they would be protected being hurt. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of them have lost their funding. I don't know the answer to that. Does anybody know?
No, I'm not sure it's an exact correlation, but I mean, we're aware of Global Refuge and Catholic Charities and these organizations, because of their work with immigrants and the homeless, that those are getting cut, but that's more targeted than incidental.
Amy?
Well, I believe that the Missouri legislature is proposing to put the 10 Commandments in classrooms.
Yes, they are.
That, but yeah.
Yeah, I just signed a letter about that.
I think in the question of how successful, it really depends on what part of the country you're in.
Yep,
'Cause
good
out
point.
here in California, I don't see an awful lot of that, and I would say it's not very successful. But what you hear in the news in Texas and whatever else, been very successful.
I will say, driving across Kansas, which I do, I have seen In God We Trust on quite a number of license plates.
I heard my home state of Missouri invoked. We do have our share of problems out here.
Having been to the capital, Jefferson City for several hearings around anti-queer legislation, I heard somebody speaking, what the author of the bill, of a bill that was going to, they called it parents' rights, was very clear, although you had to kind of back her into a corner. But ultimately, it became really obvious that what she wanted was for it to be okay to talk about Martha Washington, but not talk about Pete Buttigieg's husband. So when she was kind of backed into a corner, it was really obvious. She didn't want to limit people being able to talk about George Washington's wife, but she wanted to make sure you couldn't talk about Pete Buttigieg's husband. So, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, just
So legislating religious values is there, yes.
yes. Just yesterday in Missouri, there were 4 individuals that gave testimony in a Senate subcommittee hearing, Judiciary and Civil and Criminal Jurisprudence, in reference to Senate Bill 589, which would remove the statute of limitations on CSA cases, as well as speaking in favor of Trey's Law because of Kanakuk Camps, which is one of those charismatic evangelical things. Trey's Law was also is also being pushed in Texas. So I'm working with Senator Brian Williams, and I reached out to him this morning. I'm in the I've already done my email contacts with all the members of the committee. So I'm getting involved directly in this because the first 2 testimonies that were given were survivor witness statements from 2 of my victims. So I'm glad this is on the Senate floor now. We're working on it.
I'm not sure what you're referring to. Can you explain a little bit more? Trey's Law and
Trey is the name of a young man that committed suicide after having suffered abuse at Kanakuk Camps, which is identified as a Christian camp for boys, a summer camp type thing. And it's a really horrible case. If you want to get all the details in one lump sum, there is a YouTube channel called Fundy Fridays, FUNDIE, Fundy Fridays. And Jen did a 3+ hour piece on Kanakuk Camps. And our current governor's name gets invoked as being involved. So yeah, it's ugly.
Well, and
Donna?
Yep.
No, sorry, I was gonna say we do have one other question just from Ashley. Are we seeing these, such as the license plates, are you seeing it more lately? Because it does feel like it's been, or it's always been there and in Kansas.
I don't know the answer to that. I think that there are more states that have added the ability to put "In God We Trust" on your license, and some other. There, you can also put the snake flag. Sorry, I'm not coming up.
Don't tread on me.
Yeah, the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. It has a name, and I'm not thinking of it at the moment. But states are adding things like that, and that is a very political state symbol. So the line between what we think is appropriate public discourse, and I would argue that a license plate on the back of your car kind of is definitely being affected by these folks. The point of whether you've heard of Project Blitz, you probably have noticed that there is a very concerted effort. There's a lot of boilerplate legislation. We have state houses across the country that are trying to pass the exact same pieces of legislation because they're just being handed a bill and then they sign their name to it and send it through the legislature. The folks have gotten quite organized, and they've organized against, it's no longer communism we're organizing against, it's everything else. Okay, I want to get through this one slide because this is, it's 101. We'll start with this slide next time. I'm not going to hold you over. We are almost to the peaceful moment, so we'll start here next week. We'll finish up the timeline and talk about some of the core levers and tools of this movement, and then we'll talk a little bit about how folks like us can begin to respond and what we can do. Thank you all.